The map on the wall told a story no one wanted to say out loud. It was the winter of 1944. The pens and arrows marked positions across Western Europe. American, British, Canadian forces pushing east. German forces holding, retreating, counterattacking. The lines moved, then they stopped, then they moved again. And in a cold stone room somewhere in France, a supreme Allied commander stood in front of that map and said nothing for a long time. Dwight D. Eisenhower was not a man who celebrated early. He had seen too much go wrong to trust a map that looked good. He had watched men die on beaches that were supposed to be secured by breakfast. He had approved plans that worked and plans that didn't, and he had learned that war had a way of humiliating the confident. But even Eisenhower, calm, steady, deliberate Eisenhower, could feel something shifting. The Germans were losing ground. Not all at once, not cleanly. The Wehrmacht did not simply fold. These were soldiers who had fought across 2 continents, officers who had studied war their entire lives, commanders who had shocked the world with their speed and precision just 4 years earlier. They did not go quietly, but they were going. And the question everyone around Eisenhower was asking, quietly, cautiously, the way soldiers ask questions they're afraid to jinx, was whether this was the beginning of the end, or just another temporary shift before Germany found a way to push back. Eisenhower knew the answer. He just wasn't ready to say it yet. To understand what that moment meant, you have to understand where it started. Not in 1944, not even in 1943. You have to go back to the beginning, to the years when Germany seemed genuinely unstoppable, when the map looked nothing like it did in that stone room in France. In 1940, Germany had conquered France in 6 weeks. 6 weeks! A country with one of the largest armies in Europe, a country that had bled Germany dry in the First World War, fell so fast that the world sat in stunned silence. The Blitzkrieg, lightning war, wasn't just a military tactic, it was a psychological event. It told the world that the old rules no longer applied. Speed, coordination, air power, and armored strength used together could collapse an enemy before they had time to respond. Germany followed that victory with more. North Africa, the Balkans. Then in June 1941, Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union on a front that stretched for over 1,000 miles. In the early months, German forces advanced at a rate that seemed impossible. They took prisoners by the hundreds of thousands. They pushed deep into Soviet territory. Adolf Hitler, standing in Berlin, looked at his maps and saw the face of a conquered world. But the world had not finished reacting. America entered the war in December 1941, and America was different. Not because its soldiers were better trained, many of them weren't, not yet. Not because its generals were more brilliant, some of them were learning as they went. America was different because of what sat behind its soldiers. Factories, steel mills, oil refineries, shipyards that ran 24 hours a day. A production capacity so enormous that it defied military logic. When America committed to the war, it did not simply send men, it sent a flood. Tanks, aircraft, artillery shells, trucks, uniforms, boots, food, fuel, all of it produced at a scale Germany could not match, had not matched, and could not hope to match now that the engine was running. Eisenhower understood this. He had spent years studying it. Before he ever commanded a single soldier in combat, he had spent his career thinking about logistics, about supply chains, about the relationship between industrial strength and battlefield outcome. He knew that wars were not won by brilliant moments alone. They were won by the side that could sustain pressure long enough for brilliant moments to matter. And in 1944, America could sustain pressure like nothing the world had ever seen. The Normandy landings on June 6, 1944, D-Day, were the visible symbol of that capacity. Nearly 5,000 ships, over 11,000 aircraft, more than 150,000 soldiers crossing the English Channel in a single day. The sheer scale of it was staggering. The Germans had known an invasion was coming. They had built the Atlantic Wall, miles of fortifications, concrete bunkers, artillery positions, minefields, specifically to stop it. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding the German defense in France, had told his staff that the first 24 hours would decide the war. He was right. He just had the outcome wrong. The landings succeeded. Not easily, not without enormous cost, particularly at Omaha Beach, where American soldiers died in the water, on the sand, at the wire, in the first gray light of that terrible morning. But they succeeded. The foothold was established, and from that point forward, the question was not whether the Allies would be in France. They were in France. The question was what Germany would do about it. What Germany did was fight, hard, disciplined, intelligent fighting. The Bulge country of Normandy, the dense hedgerows and narrow lanes of the Norman countryside, turned out to be perfect defensive terrain. Every field was a fortress. Every hedgerow concealed a machine gun position or an anti-tank gun. German commanders watching from the other side saw this and allowed themselves a dangerous thought. Maybe the Allies could be held. Maybe the lodgment in Normandy could be contained. Maybe the Atlantic Wall had failed at the beach but could be rebuilt inland, line by line, village by village. Maybe America's industrial advantage didn't matter if the terrain was right. This was the enemy's confidence, and it was not entirely justified. Eisenhower felt the pressure. He was managing not just a military campaign, but a coalition, American, British, Canadian, Free French forces, each with their own commanders, their own national pride. General Bernard Montgomery, commanding British and Canadian forces, moved at a pace that frustrated Eisenhower and infuriated the Americans watching from across the Atlantic. Political figures in Washington were asking questions. Newspaper headlines were asking questions. The summer was slipping by, and the breakout that was supposed to happen hadn't happened. And then came Cobra. Operation Cobra, launched on July 25, 1944, was the plan designed to finally crack the German defense open. It began with something that had never been done before on that scale, a massive carpet bombing of the German front lines just ahead of the American ground forces. Hundreds of bombers, thousands of tons of explosives dropped on a narrow corridor of Norman farmland. The intention was to stun the German defenders so completely that American armor could pour through the gap before they recovered. The bombing was devastating. It was also, in a tragic error, partially short. Some bombs fell on American positions, killing and wounding American soldiers, including a general. It was the kind of catastrophic mistake that could destroy morale, that could make men question whether the plan was sound or the leadership was competent. Eisenhower, when he learned of it, felt the weight of it in a way that those who have never sent men into battle cannot fully understand. These were his decisions. These were his men.
But American soldiers, the ones who survived the short bombs, who saw their friends die from their own Air Force's mistake, they attacked anyway. They pushed forward into the smoke and the rubble and the stunned German lines, and they broke through. The breakout was sudden and total. General George S. Patton's Third Army, which had been waiting, restrained for exactly this moment, was unleashed. Patton, aggressive, brilliant, relentless, sometimes reckless, drove his columns forward at a pace that left the German command staggering. Towns fell, roads opened. The German line didn't bend, it shattered. Within days, American forces were racing across France. The speed was intoxicating. Soldiers who had spent weeks fighting for single hedgerows were now covering 20, 30, 40 miles in a day. German units that had held fixed positions suddenly found themselves cut off, encircled, overwhelmed. Thousands surrendered. Thousands more tried to retreat and were caught by air power and artillery. The Falaise Pocket, the encirclement of a massive German force in Normandy, became one of the most destructive defeats Germany suffered in the Western campaign. Entire divisions were destroyed. Roads were choked with destroyed vehicles and German dead. This was the turning point. This was the moment Eisenhower had been building toward since before the landings, since before the training, since before the years of planning in cold rooms with maps on the wall. This was what all of it had been for. Paris was liberated on August 25, 1944. The images came back to America in newspapers and newsreels. French civilians lining the streets, American and Free French soldiers marching under the Arc de Triomphe. 4 years of German occupation ended in a day of enormous joy. For Americans back home, for the families of men who had died on the beaches, for the workers in the factories and shipyards who had spent years building the machinery of liberation, it was a moment that meant something beyond military calculation. Eisenhower stood in the middle of it all and felt, perhaps for the first time, something close to certainty. But he was careful with it. He was always careful, because the war was not over. Germany still held a line. Hitler refused to accept the reality his generals could see clearly, that the Wehrmacht in the West was shattered, that the supply lines were exhausted, that the manpower was gone, that the Air Force that had dominated European skies in 1940 was now a shadow fighting against Allied air superiority that was total and overwhelming. Hitler refused, and so Germany fought on. In September 1944, a bold Allied plan called Operation Market Garden attempted to drive deep into Holland, cross the Rhine, and potentially end the war before Christmas. It failed, narrowly but decisively, at Arnhem, the famous bridge too far. The Germans, written off by some Allied planners, turned out to still have enough fight left to hold that critical objective. The autumn slowed, the advance stalled. Supply lines had stretched so far, so fast, that American tanks were running low on fuel. And then, in December, Germany did something no one had expected. The Ardennes offensive, what Americans came to call the Battle of the Bulge, was Hitler's last gamble. A massive German armored assault through the Ardennes forest, the same route German forces had used to shock the world in 1940, aimed at splitting the Allied lines, capturing the critical supply port of Antwerp, and forcing a negotiated peace before the Soviets reached Germany from the east. In the first days, it worked. American units were caught off guard. The early weather grounded Allied air power. German armor drove deep into the Allied lines, creating the bulge that gave the battle its name. Panic, or something close to it, moved through Allied headquarters. The gains of the summer seemed suddenly fragile. The map that had looked so promising in August looked frightening in December. Eisenhower did not panic. His response to the German breakthrough was not retreat or desperation, it was clarity. He called his senior commanders together and told them directly, the German attack had given the Allies an opportunity. The Germans had come out of their defensive positions. They were exposed. When the weather cleared, when Allied air power could fly again, the result would be devastating for Germany. He was right. The weather broke. Air power struck the German columns. American forces, including the 101st Airborne Division, surrounded at Bastogne, whose commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, answered a German demand for surrender with a single word, nuts, held their ground and then counterattacked. Patton's Third Army turned 90 degrees in the middle of winter and drove north to relieve Bastogne in a movement that military historians still study for its audacity and execution. By late January 1945, the Bulge was eliminated. Germany had spent its last reserves, its last tanks, its last experienced soldiers, its last fuel on a gamble that had failed. What came after was not a battle, it was a collapse. Allied forces crossed the Rhine in March 1945. American soldiers reached the Elbe River in April. Soviet forces were closing on Berlin from the east. Hitler, in his bunker beneath the capital, refused reality until reality refused him. He died by his own hand on April 30th, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8th. The war in Europe was over. And in those final months, as the end became clear, not hoped for, not projected, but actually clear, measurable, visible, Eisenhower said something that those who were with him remembered for the rest of their lives. He said that the outcome had never been in doubt. Not in the way that sounds like arrogance, not in the way that dismisses the cost, the sacrifice, the enormous human weight of what had been endured. He meant it as the conclusion of a calculation he had been running since before the war, since his years studying logistics and industrial capacity and the relationship between production and power. He meant that America, once committed, could not be beaten by any force Germany could field. Not because American soldiers were invincible, they weren't. Not because Allied planning was perfect, it wasn't. But because the arithmetic was simply impossible to overcome. Germany in 1944 was producing tanks at a rate America was matching in a single factory. Germany was rationing fuel while American refineries ran at full capacity. Germany was calling up teenagers and old men for its final defense, while America still had trained divisions waiting to deploy. The gap was not tactical, it was structural. And no amount of tactical brilliance, no matter how real, no matter how costly to Allied forces in the short term, could close a structural gap of that magnitude. Eisenhower knew this. He had built his strategy around it. The Normandy landings, the breakout, the liberation of France, the drive toward Germany, all of it was the application of sustained, overwhelming industrial pressure. The goal was never a single brilliant stroke. The goal was to bring America's full weight to bear and let that weight do what weight does. It crushed.
What makes Eisenhower's story important, not just historically, but in terms of what it means to lead in a moment of enormous stakes, is not the dramatic moments. It's the discipline between the dramatic moments. It's the steady, clear-eyed refusal to be swept into either despair or premature celebration. When the Bulge hit in December and his headquarters was shaken, Eisenhower was the one who saw the opportunity in the crisis. When Paris fell and euphoria was everywhere, Eisenhower was the one reminding his commanders that the war was not finished and that complacency would cost lives. Leadership, as Eisenhower practiced it, was not performance. It was judgment, repeated daily, under pressure, with incomplete information, and with the knowledge that the wrong call had consequences measured in human lives. That is a harder thing to portray than a general standing on a tank. It is harder to see and harder to celebrate, but it is what actually wins wars. The German commanders who faced him understood this, even if they understood it too late. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who commanded German forces in the West during much of this period, was asked after the war what he considered the greatest factor in Germany's defeat on the Western Front. His answer was not the brilliance of Allied tactics. It was not a single battle or a single decision. It was the supply. The relentless, impossible, never-ending flow of American equipment and men. Every tank they destroyed, 10 more appeared. Every artillery piece silenced, 20 more opened up. Every unit exhausted, a fresh one rotated in. You cannot defeat that, von Rundstedt said. You can only delay it. Eisenhower had known that. He had bet everything on it, and he had been right.
The world that came out of that war, the Europe rebuilt under American leadership, the institutions created to prevent another conflict of that scale, the decades of relative peace in Western Europe that followed, rested on decisions made in those cold stone rooms, on that map, in that terrible winter and that extraordinary summer. It rested on the judgment of a man who refused to celebrate too early, refused to despair too easily, and understood that the most important quality in a leader facing history-defining pressure is not brilliance, it is steadiness. There is something worth sitting with in that. We remember the war through its dramatic images, the beaches, the tanks, the liberation parades, the surrender ceremony on the deck of the USS Missouri. These images are real and they matter, but behind them is a longer, quieter story of calculation and endurance and the patient application of overwhelming American power. The Germans began to lose ground not in a single moment. They lost it inch by inch, month by month, decision by decision, as Allied pressure mounted and German capacity to respond diminished. And Eisenhower watched it happen, said little in public, and understood privately that this was exactly how it was supposed to go. He had seen it coming. He had built the machine to make it happen, and when it did, he felt not triumph, but something more complicated, a deep, serious satisfaction mixed with the weight of what it had cost. In a letter to his wife Mamie, written in the final months of the war, Eisenhower described the feeling not as victory, but as relief. Relief that the calculation had held. Relief that the men who had not died for nothing. Relief that the thing he had believed, the thing he had organized and fought for and defended against doubt and political pressure and the fog of war, had turned out to be true. America's strength, properly organized and relentlessly applied, was enough. It was always enough. The question history leaves us with, the one that doesn't have a simple answer, is whether we still understand that, whether we remember that the steadiness Eisenhower carried through the war, the refusal to perform confidence he didn't feel or despair he couldn't afford, the quiet discipline of leading through complexity without losing sight of the fundamental truth underneath it, whether that kind of leadership is something we still recognize when we see it. Or whether we've gotten so used to looking for the dramatic gesture, the bold declaration, the moment built for the camera, that we've forgotten what actual leadership in an actual crisis looks like. Eisenhower never gave a speech at Normandy. He wrote a note accepting full responsibility in case the landings failed, a note he folded and kept in his pocket, ready to release if thousands of men died and the invasion collapsed. He threw it away when the landings succeeded. Nobody photographed that moment. There was nothing to photograph. It was just a man, alone with the weight of what he'd decided, doing what leaders have always had to do in private, before the world finds out whether they were right. What do you think that kind of leadership cost him? And do you think we'd recognize it today if we saw it?